Hello everyone, thank you for attending our webinar, Managing Mental Health Disabilities in the Workplace. Today presenting is myself, Lauren Oldham, and my colleague Ellen Adams. Before we begin, I'm just going to give a few announcements. First, if you could raise your hand icon if you can hear me. Also, during the presentation, you can send questions anytime and we'll answer these at the end of the presentation. There will also be an option to download the presentation at the end. SHRM certification information will be provided at the end, so you can turn that in. Also at the end, if you could please fill out the survey you will receive later today to help us plan future webinars. Our next employment training is going to be Tuesday, October 3rd in Oklahoma City and Thursday, October 5th in Tulsa. Email Melissa Bogle at mbogle@gablelaw.com for more information. And if you've participated today, you've automatically been added to future invitations. Okay, so before we begin, I just want to highlight a few of the takeaways that I hope that you will take away from this presentation. First, we want you to know how to identify mental health impairments that are considered a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Once you've been able to identify these disabilities, we want you to know how and when to initiate an interactive dialogue with your employees. We also want you to leave this presentation knowing what rights and responsibilities individuals with mental health disabilities have under the ADA. And lastly, we want you to know what rights and responsibilities you, the employer, have in providing reasonable job accommodations that will help individuals with mental health disabilities to secure employment or successfully maintain existing employment. One point I want to emphasize is that managing mental health disabilities in the workplace is something that you will experience. Studies show that 1 in 5, and actually other studies show as many as 1 in 4, adults will experience a serious mental illness. In addition, nearly 1 in 5 adults in America lives with a serious mental illness. Working with people who have or at some point who will experience a mental health impairment, you need to know how to identify these requests for accommodations and know how to walk through the accommodation process with them. So what are the most common mental health impairments? Studies show that as many as 18% of people suffer from an anxiety disorder. And these include things such as post-traumatic stress, obsessive-compulsive disorders, panic disorders, and generalized anxiety disorder. 9.5% of the population suffer from depression. 4% have attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder. 2.6% have bipolar disorder, and around 1% have schizophrenia. So what is a mental disability? The ADA is the most significant employment legislation, and it's intended to ensure that individuals with disabilities are not excluded from job opportunities unless they are actually unable to do the job. The ADA requires an employer must make a reasonable accommodation to the physical or mental limitations of a qualified individual with a disability unless the employer can show that the reasonable accommodation will cause an undue hardship to the business. So what is the definition of a disability? The statute defines disability as any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. Now, the first part of the definition, mental impairment, is defined by the ADA to include any psychological disorder, intellectual disability, organic brain syndrome, emotional or mental illness, and certain learning disorders. The second part of the definition focuses on substantial limits. And this definition states that you must substantially limit one or more major life activity. The EEOC uses 3 factors to determine a substantial limitation. The first one is the nature and severity of the impairment. Secondly, how long the impairment is expected to last. And lastly, whether the impairment is characterized as permanent or long-term. These factors are important because it's not the name of the impairment or the condition that determines whether a person is protected by the ADA, but rather the effect of the impairment or condition on the life of a particular person. The EEOC has stated many times that impairments may be disabling for some individuals, but not for others, and it depends on the impact on that person's life activities. The last portion of the definition focuses on major life activities, and these are major life activities that an average person can perform with no difficulty. Examples would include eating, sleeping, walking, speaking, or hearing. Also learning, standing, working, and just caring for oneself generally. It's important to note that it's not necessary to consider if a person is substantially limited in the major life activity of working. If a person cannot sleep, learn, or communicate, there's no need to determine if their ability to work is impaired, as there is a disability substantially limiting one or more major life activity. It's also important to note that mitigating measures cannot be considered in determining whether someone with a mental impairment is substantially limited in regard to a major life activity. However, mitigating measures can be considered as you evaluate the accommodation process, and individuals who do not take mitigating measures may not be considered a qualified individual. Again, these are some of the major life activities to look for, and they include eating, sleeping, standing, reading, concentrating, communicating, and other major bodily functions. These mental impairments almost always constitute a disability, and they include major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and schizophrenia. All of these substantially limit one or more of these major life activities that we've seen. It should also be assumed that a mental impairment could be covered by the ADA if it can be diagnosed and it has some adverse impact on the person's life or activity to do their job. It's important to note even a mental impairment that is episodic or in remission is a disability if it would substantially limit a major life activity when active. So what does this mean? Even if an employee has their mental health impairment under control through medication, the disability does not go away, and they're still entitled to an accommodation. Similarly, if a person has not experienced feelings of depression in, say, 6 months, this does not mean that the employer can stop the accommodation process because the disability is in remission or currently under control. So what can employers ask candidates during the interview and pre-hire stage? In most situations, employees may keep their health private. The ADA makes it unlawful to ask health-related questions except in certain circumstances. 4 common situations where health-related inquiries can be made include after a conditional job offer has been made, but before employment begins, when engaging in affirmative action for people with disabilities, when an employee requests a reasonable accommodation for an impairment, and when there is objective evidence the employee may be unable to perform the essential functions of the job or may pose a direct threat to the health or safety of themselves or others due to an impairment. Generally, a disability-related inquiry, as I said, can be made if there's reasonable belief based on objective evidence. The objective evidence must state that the employee's ability to perform essential job functions will be impaired by a medical condition or an employee will pose a direct threat due to medical conditions. Now, I'm going to provide some examples of what objective evidence could be. First, if you have an employee, say a tax auditor, and they've done fewer audits than normal, The employee has made numerous mistakes in assessing whether taxpayers provide appropriate documentation, and the employee tells the supervisor that the medication she takes for depression makes her lethargic and unable to concentrate. Based on the employee's explanation for their performance, the agency has reasonable belief that the employee's ability to perform the essential job functions are impaired because of their medical condition. Therefore, the supervisor may make a disability-related inquiry or ask the employee to provide documentation for their healthcare provider. Another example is, say a supervisor heard a secretary tell her coworker that she's had major mood swings and is afraid that she may have bipolar disorder. Since that conversation, the secretary still comes to work every day and performs the duties in the normal, efficient manner. In this case, the employer does not have a reasonable belief based on objective evidence, either that the secretary's ability to perform her essential job functions will be impaired or that she will pose a direct threat due to a medical condition. Therefore, the employer cannot make a disability-related inquiry or require the employee to submit to a medical examination. It's important to remember that disclosure is a choice. According to the ADA, employers can't require applicants or employees to disclose a disability. So in many cases, disclosing a disability is a choice, not a requirement. And you should remember that individuals who choose not to tell their employer about their mental health conditions, they're not lying or hiding. This is a legally protected right that they're choosing to exercise. After the job offer has been made, applicants may be asked to take a medical exam before starting. If this exam reveals a psychiatric disability, the job offer can only be withdrawn if there is evidence that the disability can't be reasonably accommodated or poses a real safety issue. Employees generally can't be required to tell employers about a psychiatric disability unless they're requesting an accommodation. Then the employer can only then can the employer ask for some medical documentation about the disability. And it's important to remember that any medical information that's shared cannot be disclosed to others within the workplace. Lastly, employees who are federal contractors must invite applicants and employees to voluntarily self-disclose a disability. This information is only used to track the progress in meeting disability employment goals to the employer, and it must be kept confidential. Now I want to highlight the after-the-job medical examinations. These are only done in limited circumstances for employees who work in positions affecting public safety, such as police officers, firefighters, or airline pilots. And even in these limited situations, the exams must address specific job-related concerns. As I mentioned before, whether you know it or not, 1 in 5 of your current employees has either suffered or will experience a psychiatric disability. So as an organization, it's important that you develop your capacity to respond effectively when a mental illness arises. It's a key talent management practice that clearly connects to your ability to fully leverage talent. It's also important to realize that employees may not always come forward. The decision to come forward with an accommodation request is particularly challenging for employees because of the many misconceptions around mental health conditions. Yet it's important for you to make your employees comfortable and that they feel and that you have an open dialogue, and so they feel comfortable to request an accommodation before a disability impacts their job. Employers can always act where there's a clear safety concern, but these actions must be grounded in evidence. Vague or general fears that workers with psychiatric disabilities are going to be violent in the workplace is not supported by the evidence and would not in itself constitute a safety concern. And again, I want to highlight that normally It's not going to be the HR representative or the executive who are confronted with these issues. Rather, it's going to be your managers and the people on the ground who are interacting with the employees on a day-to-day basis. And this is why it's so important that managers receive training to help them navigate issues involving mental health. Having an effective employee assistance program is one way to encourage employees to share any accommodation requests they may need. These groups can go a long way towards creating a positive climate to help employees stay effective when working with psychiatric disabilities. Also, because mental health conditions are highly stigmatized and misunderstood, workers are more likely than others to experience workplace harassment. Send the message across the workplace that workers with psychiatric disabilities have the same rights to respect an effective workplace as any other worker with a disability. And this can be done by building trust. This is the most important aspect of the workplace climate and can be the least tangible. Ask yourself questions about the climate of your workplace. What actually happens to employees with psychiatric disabilities in your workplace? What happens to them when they come forward with these accommodation requests? Are they able to stay on the job? Or do they leave the job either voluntarily or involuntarily? It's important that you do not reach any conclusions about what disabilities the employee may have. Do not make employment decisions based on any assumptions, and avoid adverse actions or changing jobs. Under the ADA, a covered entity is regarded. An employee can be regarded as having a disability when the employer takes actions due to assumptions or misconceived notions they have about an impairment. So it's important to make sure that you're not taking any adverse action or doing anything just because an employee discloses that they may suffer from an impairment. It's important that you actually go through and walk through the accommodation process with the employee. Next, we're going to talk about how to know when a request for a reasonable accommodation has been made. According to the EEOC, you only have to let your employer know what you need when you need adjustment or change at work for a reason related to a medical condition. You can use just plain English to make your request, and you don't have to actually mention the ADA or use the phrase reasonable accommodation. Also, requests for reasonable accommodations do not need to be made in writing. Individuals may request accommodations in conversations, or they may use any other mode of communication. However, an employer may choose to write a note or a letter confirming that an individual has made a request. Alternatively, an employer can also ask an individual to fill out a form or submit the request in written form, but the employer cannot ignore the initial verbal request. Okay, so first we're going to go over some examples of a request for accommodation generally, and then review some that are specific to mental health. The first example is an employee tells her supervisor, "I'm having trouble getting to work at my scheduled starting time because of medical treatments I'm undergoing." This is a request for a reasonable accommodation. While the words accommodation or disability were not used, the individual has notified their employer that they are having trouble performing their job due to a medical condition. The next example, an employee tells their supervisor, "I need 6 weeks off to get treatment for a back problem." This is also a request for reasonable accommodation. A new employee who uses a wheelchair informs the employer that their wheelchair cannot fit under the desk in their office. This would also be an example of a reasonable accommodation, as the employee is signaling that due to a mental or physical impairment, they are having difficulty at work. Lastly, an employee tells their supervisor that he would like a new chair because his present one is uncomfortable. Although this is a request for a change at work, his statement is insufficient to put the employer on notice that he's requesting accommodation. In this situation, unlike the others, he does not link his need for the new chair with any medical condition. Moving into some examples that deal specifically with mental impairment. What happens if an employee tells a supervisor, I need to leave, and I need to leave right now? This is made by an employee whom the employer knew to have bipolar disorder and who was in the middle of an anxiety attack. The Eighth Circuit held that this was not a request for a reasonable accommodation. Another real-life example. An employee tells a supervisor, I'm stressed and I cannot perform my duties in a proper and safe manner right now. I need to leave. I'm under doctor's care. It's on file in HR. In this case, the court held that this was a request for a reasonable accommodation. The employee told the employer about a medical condition and explained how it was impacting their ability to perform their job. A family member, friend, health professional, or other representative may request a reasonable accommodation on behalf of an individual with a disability. Of course, the individual with the disability may refuse to accept an accommodation that is not needed. So what does a request on behalf of someone else look like? This can be a doctor's note outlining medical restrictions for an employee. It could also be an employee's spouse who calls the employee's supervisor to inform them that the employee has had a medical emergency, say due to a panic episode, and they needed to be hospitalized, and thus requires time off. This discussion constitutes a request for a reasonable accommodation. Another example, say an employee has been out of work for a few weeks after experiencing an episode from their bipolar disorder. The employee's doctor sends the employer a letter stating that the employee is released to return to work, but with certain work restrictions, such as the need for a flexible work schedule. This letter would constitute a request for a reasonable accommodation. At this time, I'm going to pass it over to Ellen Adams, and she's going to discuss with you how to walk through the interactive process once an employee has made a request for a reasonable accommodation.
Thank you, Lauren. So now that we've covered what constitutes a disability and pre-employment inquiries and when a request has been made, we move on to what the employer needs to do to participate effectively in the interactive process. As the request has been made, the first thing that an employer needs to do is be prepared to engage as quickly as possible and to promptly provide the accommodation absent undue hardship. But keep in mind, this doesn't mean having a reaction. It means beginning what is an interactive process. It's important to note that this interactive process isn't simply disapproving a request for accommodation that the employer determines is too burdensome, nor is it simply offering an accommodation that the employee won't accept. In order to demonstrate good faith, as we'll discuss a little bit later, an employer really has an obligation to engage in a process and in order to properly defend itself against any potential claims that might arise, to document that interactive process as well. What Lauren pointed out is worth noting again, that while discerning whether an employee has a disability is important, the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act has substantially broadened the definition of what constitutes a disability. So employers must make sure that they are getting the interactive process right and documenting it. As Lauren emphasized, employers can assume a mental impairment is a disability under a broad set of circumstances. So if we're making some assumptions that mental impairments are going to be deemed a disability under the ADA and or the broadened definition of disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act, Amendments Act, we need to make sure that we're documenting and effectively engaging with our employees as part of the interactive process. So what is the process? Employers must grant reasonable accommodations for mental disabilities unless it would impose an undue hardship. How does an employer begin that process? It begins once an employee discloses a mental impairment and requests an accommodation. It can also begin if an employer knows or is given reason to know an employee is disabled and requires an accommodation, even if the employee does not request it. So this means that if you're aware of a condition that your employee is suffering with that is likely to constitute a disability, and you see them struggling to perform essential job functions, then an employer does know or has reason to know an employee is disabled and requires an accommodation, and the employer in that instance should begin the interactive accommodation process according to the EEOC's enforcement guidance. Another way that the interactive accommodation process might be triggered is when an employer has a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that an employee's inability to perform an essential job function is due to a mental condition. So another example of when, in the absence of a request, an employer could have some reasonable belief and the employer would itself be triggered to begin the interactive accommodation process. Anytime we talk about something that's slightly different, so typically I think we think of reasonable accommodations and the ADA as one involving physical symptoms. There's really no reason to think about the process being any different in the context of mental health or mental impairments. It's the same process, and the case law that you have heard and probably been trained on in the context of physical limitations is the exact same process in the context of mental health. It's important that you review your policies to ensure that those policies are up to date, and it's very important that your supervisors and managers, who, as Lauren mentioned, are the individuals that are going to be dealing with this on a regular basis, know how and when the interactive accommodation process is supposed to proceed forward. At the same time that you want to have great policies in place and great training to follow, employers continue to need to recognize the obligation that this is an individualized assessment. So each employee within this framework still needs to be looked at as an individual. What would work in some situations might not work in others. So it's important that employers follow their policies but make individualized assessments. So one point I do want to emphasize before we move off this slide is under the Family Medical Leave Act, employees are given certain rights to take time off. The ADA does not have the same length of service requirement as the FMLA. So just because you have an employee that's not eligible to take leave, they might be eligible for leave based on a disability, and that might be an accommodation to look at. So on the front end, if your employee is denied leave, make sure that you're not dealing with a leave request that could constitute a request for accommodation. On the back end, if an employee does take leave under FMLA and is returning to work, you might be aware that the employee has a disability and requires some accommodation when they return to work. So when they return to work, that might trigger this interactive accommodation process. So just some examples of when to think through in real time whether the interactive accommodation process has been triggered. And given the sensitive nature of a mental impairment, it's important to note that the employee might not be the one coming forward with the request as often as the employee might be willing to come forward with a request for some type of physical accommodation at work. Therefore, an employer might have to be more sensitive to issues that are arising in the workplace that deal with mental health. With that said, an employer is rather limited in what they can request after an employee has started to work to gain information that they might need. This slide here that you see is the EEOC's recommendation to healthcare providers on what to provide in response to their patient or your employee's request for information. This is a mirror of what an employer might need to determine what constitutes a disability and what reasonable accommodations would actually be effective in managing that disability. So the EEOC recommends that healthcare providers provide the following: information about their professional qualifications. This is so an employer can ascertain whether the medical professional at issue has the expertise to address the client's condition. So for instance, a cardiologist might not have the credentials to speak to a particular patient's anxiety disorder. On the other hand, they might, if it's having some physical symptoms, addressing the physical consequences of that anxiety disorder in their patient. So having the professional qualifications of the doctor will allow the employer to assess whether that particular professional has the requisite experience. The nature of the client's condition, so what exactly is your employee's diagnosis? What functional limitations will that employee have in the workplace in the absence of treatment? And then what does the employee need for reasonable accommodation? And having some recommended accommodations is also very helpful for an employer to be able to assess a recommendation from a medical health professional. But you won't always be in a position to request medical information from your employee. As Lauren emphasized, prior to employment, you're not asking any disability-related questions. After a conditional offer is made, you may ask some limited disability-related questions if it's the same type of medical inquiry for any person in a particular job category, and it's to meet essential job functions for those positions. Outside of that context, once an employee has started working, you have to have some objective evidence that a person lacks the ability to perform essential job functions, or you can make a request if it's to ascertain whether the employee has a disability and whether the reasonable accommodation is necessary to allow that employee to function and perform those essential job functions. But you can't ask for medical documentation if it's obvious. So there's an important distinction to make for an employer about whether the employee's condition is obvious or non-obvious. If it's clear that you have an employee who has a disability and that disability is affecting their work performance, you cannot ask for further documentation. However, if it's non-obvious, you are permitted to ask for sufficient information to be able to evaluate the employee's request for a reasonable accommodation. When asking for this information from an employee, make sure that you limit your request to be as specific as possible. Overly broad requests can get you into trouble under a variety of different laws, and so you want to get your employee to give you a release for specific information that you need to evaluate the request, and you also want to make sure anytime you're making a medical request that you use the safe harbor language under the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. That's known as GINA, and it essentially protects employers from getting overly broad information in response to a request. So you always want to make sure that you include that in asking for medical information from an employee. If you have an employee that has not come forward to you with a request and you have some concerns, some objective evidence about their ability to perform essential job functions, or have concerns that they are a direct threat, as Lauren emphasized, that is another reason why you can request a medical examination or information. But it's a tricky area where you want to exercise caution in making those requests. So here on the slide we have a list of questions to ask an employee to begin the interactive process. What are the employee's limitations? How do those impact the employee's ability to do his or her job? What specific job tasks are problematic? What accommodations are available to reduce or eliminate these problems? Something the employer should make sure that they're asking is, are all possible resources being used to determine possible accommodations? We'll talk a little bit more about this, but when you're deciding whether providing an accommodation would cause undue hardship, be very cautious about saying it would cost too much, especially if you're making that decision without accessing all available resources. There are a wide variety of resources that are out there that can help employers with cost of providing accommodations for disabilities, and courts have not looked upon employers favorably who have said this would pose an undue hardship without cost, where those employers did not document their attempts to seek other resources, including financial resources. So finally, does the employee have any suggestions as to what could be done to help with those items? So essentially, as an employer, you're asking the employee, you're soliciting information from them as part of an interactive process for the employee to tell you what would help, what would assist in the performance of essential job functions. Going back to the medical requests, an employer just needs to be cautious that they're not asking for too much to substantiate if you already have enough information to effectively evaluate a request for reasonable accommodation. If you ask for too much, it could be perceived as a failure to accommodate or even as retaliation as to the employee for making the request in the first place. The mindset through which to engage in this interactive process is one of having an assumption that it will be successful. So as you engage with your employee, you should assume that you are going to come out on the other end of this interactive process with a reasonable accommodation that will allow the employee to succeed in that position. And approaching the interactive process with that mindset and documenting it is an excellent way to ensure compliance and to illustrate good faith if you're ever in a litigation battle over whether you complied with the ADA. Echoing what I just said, the interactive process requires a back and forth dialogue between the employer and the employee. There are obligations on the employer side to participate in the back and forth dialogue, and there is a requirement that the employee participate in a back and forth dialogue. We'll talk about documentation here in just a bit, but anytime an employer takes steps and the employee fails to respond, document those failures to respond, because the employee can be responsible for breaking down the interactive process. But it needs to be documented, and the employer needs to attempt to engage the employee in the interactive process. In the context of mental health, many accommodations seem to fall into one of three broad categories, and we're making some generalizations here, but just to help you think through possible accommodations. Ability to work a scheduled shift, ability to process information or focus, and ability to control emotions. After gathering information from a healthcare provider and/or from the employee, HR may need to be brainstorming and exercise some creativity to find a reasonable accommodation. If the employee doesn't propose one, the employer can't enforce the can't force the employee, to just accept whatever they propose. There really does need to be a back and forth interactive process. However, if the employer has made a reasonable accommodation after engaging in this interactive process and the employee just refuses to accept it, the employee may not be qualified under the ADA. And again here, the important aspect of this is to document the interactive back and forth to demonstrate that it was the employee refusing the reasonable accommodation. So there's this requirement that an employer actually assess whether a requested accommodation is reasonable. And as I said earlier, this requires an individualized assessment of the situation. So how, as an employer, can you demonstrate good faith during the interactive process? Well, in a case before the Third Circuit, they articulated that an employer can demonstrate good faith with actions such as regularly meeting with the employee through the interactive process and documenting those meetings, requesting information from the employee about the individual's condition and limitations, specifically asking the employee for the employee's thoughts on what would help their situation. And then the employer needs to document that they actually considered the employee's requests, whether that would work, whether it would constitute an undue hardship. And then the employer can also demonstrate good faith by discussing available alternatives. Again, this is not a situation where an employer can simply propose an accommodation that it believes is reasonable and force the employee to accept it and deem the process over. Nor is it a situation where the employee can make a request that's unduly burdensome and the employer has no further obligation. It is an interactive process which requires patience and often going back to managers and supervisors and emphasizing this is a process. It's going to take a bit of time for us to come up with an accommodation that's reasonable. Of course, whatever information you obtain as part of this process, especially medical information, should be kept separate from the employee's personnel file. Managers and supervisors should only be told if necessary to provide reasonable accommodations or meet work restrictions. Employers should not tell coworkers that an employee is receiving a reasonable accommodation, even if they ask. The EEOC has determined that constitutes disclosure that the individual has a disability. So how do you handle those coworkers that have questions about their colleagues' performance? There are two ways that I think are the most helpful for articulating what the employer is doing without disclosing anything. One is to emphasize the employer's policy of assisting employees in the successful performance of their job duties. Another is to emphasize that there are a variety of workplace issues that are personal and that the company and employer has a policy of respecting an employee's privacy in those circumstances. I think those are two responses that effectively shut down inquiries from coworkers and emphasize the employer's commitment to two policies that are advisable for every employer to have. Again, documenting the process is key. So there's several up here that are absolutely necessary to document. Also important at the very beginning stages, documenting the actual request. What did the employee say? Who did they say it to? Or documenting the objective evidence showing the disability and or the need. This brings us to job functions. So as part of this process, you're always thinking, what are the essential job functions when you're considering requests? What's the job purpose? What are the essential functions? This is a great opportunity to think about your job descriptions. If you want to list out essential job functions, be thoughtful about social and behavioral requirements that are essential to a job. For instance, communicating effectively with the public, and/or handling stressful, fast-paced environments. Those might be key and essential functions of a job, and having those in a job description, while not decisive or dispositive of the issue of whether it's an essential job function, certainly help demonstrate in a litigation matter that those are critical functions of a job, which will illuminate whether accommodations need to be made or can be made to help an employee that's perhaps suffering from a mental impairment successfully perform those essential job functions. Establishing the individual's limitations. Here you want to be precise in your documentation of the job-related limitation and how those could be overcome with a reasonable accommodation. You also want to document exploring potential accommodations. So how do you identify the potential accommodations that are out there and assess their effectiveness? And then finally, the results of the accommodation. You might try an accommodation for a period of time and ultimately decide that accommodation isn't reasonable or isn't working effectively. Those are important to document, and you want to keep track of this as it goes into effect. What are reasonable accommodations? So reasonable accommodations under the statute are ones that would allow an employee to remain in the position. They're effective if they remove a workplace barrier and allow an individual with a disability an equal opportunity to apply for a position or perform essential functions of a position or gain equal access to a benefit or privilege of employment. So those are the type of effective, reasonable accommodations that the interactive process is intended to yield. So some accommodations that we might think through here, I've got several slides to just put into perspective in the context of mental health impairments, some accommodations based on those three categories that we articulated earlier at the beginning of my portion of the presentation. So inability to concentrate, reducing distractions in the work area. What are some ways to do that? Providing a noise-canceling headset is one. Planning for uninterrupted work time is another. So having an employee have 2 hours a day where they are to be not disturbed, if that's something that they can do and perform essential job functions. That would be an example of uninterrupted work time. Increasing natural lighting or providing full spectrum lighting, dividing large assignments into smaller tasks and goals, providing memory aids such as schedules, organizers, or maybe apps if you're in a more electronic environment. Those are some of the accommodations that you might think through if your employee has a disability and has requested an accommodation for an inability to concentrate. Memory loss is another one. Written checklists, verbal prompts with reminders are some examples up on the screen. Posting written instructions for use of equipment. Allowing additional training time for new duties. These are all examples that might be reasonable under a variety of circumstances to accommodate an employee who has a disability and has indicated that they are struggling with issues of memory loss. Accommodations based on an inability to work the scheduled shift. So, for instance, if you have an employee that suffers from panic attacks based on an underlying disability, they might need some flexibility. Now, certainly there are some jobs that are not going to allow for that flexibility because of the essential job functions. But that's where it's important to note what your essential job functions are and base all decisions based off of those essential job functions. So in certain situations, there might be flexibility in the performance of essential job functions as to when they're performed. And in that instance, it would be reasonable to accommodate an employee to have flexibility where if they're experiencing a high degree of anxiety, perhaps they are allowed some time away and the flexibility to only perform work when they're not experiencing those heightened levels of anxiety. So you also have scheduling options, makeup options, modifying your attendance policy, all might be accommodations that on an individualized assessment basis might be reasonable accommodations. Stress and emotions. So key to note here, as Lauren pointed out by way of example, that certainly there are going to be some employees who experience stress, but that stress does not rise to the level of a disability. If, however, you have an employee who does have a disability that presents in debilitating stress, there are accommodations to think through based on stress and emotions, such as allowing the presence of a support animal, or using a mentor or supervisor to alert the employee when his or her behavior is becoming unprofessional or inappropriate. Again, that's more in the vein of controlling emotions. So some things to be mindful of depending on the individualized assessment given a particular job and or the particular underlying disability. Again, some other examples: restructuring a job to include only essential functions during those times of stress, referring to counseling or an employee assistance program, providing backup coverage for when the employee needs to take breaks, all examples of how an employer might accommodate based on an employee struggling with stress. The EEOC does make clear that employers can develop and enforce conduct standards as long as they're job-related and consistent with business necessity. So as we talked through those slides of stress and emotions and how to accommodate, I again emphasize this is an individualized assessment based on what are the essential job functions of a certain position, what is the employee's disability, and what is a reasonable accommodation given the employer's ability to accommodate. So if you have a prohibition on workplace violence, which I hope you do, you can enforce that prohibition as long as it's job-related and consistent with business necessity. The same with policies prohibiting insubordination, the same with policies prohibiting yelling, shoving, or cursing. So the accommodation has to be reasonable, and the employee has to be able to perform the essential job functions. Some other examples: if the employee is struggling with panic attacks for accommodation, again, the presence of a support animal might help in this instance as well. Sleep disturbances: if you have an employee who struggles with insomnia based on an underlying disability, allowing for a flexible start time. So if they have a particularly difficult time, they might be able to come to work a little bit later and stay a little bit later. That might be a reasonable accommodation depending on an individualized assessment. Employees who can't perform all the essential functions of their job and have no paid leave available may still be entitled to unpaid leave as a reasonable accommodation. They also might qualify under the Family Medical Leave Act, and those permanently unable to perform the job functions may ask their employer to reassign them to a job that they can do with an accommodation if one is available. So reassignment is sort of the accommodation of last resort. It's required only after the employer determines that there's no effective accommodations that will enable the employee to perform the essential functions of the current position, or if it would result in undue hardship. Again, as I said earlier, beware of using cost as the undue hardship without accessing or trying to access other potential resources. Some situations and solutions. These are possible accommodations from the Job Accommodation Network. The Job Accommodation Network, or JAN, is one of several services provided by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. It has been developed through collaborative efforts from the ODEP and the West Virginia University and private industry. It's free, it's an available resource, and has some very interesting accommodations to think through in the context of mental health impairment. So we'll just go through a few examples as our time is running out, but here's one. A secretary with PTSD experiences significant anxiety when she has to commute after dark, which causes difficulty concentrating and irritability. So she was accommodated with the ability to have a support animal at work and a flexible schedule with work from home during periods of minimal sunlight. Another example of how you might reasonably accommodate an employee who's struggling with a mental health impairment. A baker with obsessive compulsive disorder repeatedly checked ingredients for recipes. The individual was accommodated with a computerized checklist for each baked good recipe on the menu. So whenever the employee, in this particular instance the baker, felt the urge to check and recheck the ingredients, he had a handheld computer resembling a two-way radio that was used by other employees that allowed him to more efficiently engage in the behavior, thus still allowing him to be productive in his current position. Here's an example of a graphic designer with a panic disorder who was required to drop off design orders and pick up print proofs when necessary. He was accommodated by having an opportunity to drop off and pick up materials when coming to work in the morning. So again, he was given a scheduling accommodation, which allowed him to successfully perform those essential job functions, but in a different manner, given his panic disorder. Another example, here you have a grocery store bagger, and they had some difficulty working an early schedule and experiencing fatigue. With a sleep disorder like this, they were allowed an afternoon schedule with a workspace that had more sunlight to allow the employee to function effectively in the position despite the underlying disability. Here we have an accountant for a large agency with bipolar disorder, struggling with concentration and short-term memory loss. Because of the extreme fluctuations in his workload, this was causing him some difficulties with his work. And the accommodation was to provide a work area that was away from noise to eliminate some of those outside distractions, and was given a more consistent caseload, so there were not as many extreme fluctuations in his work to help minimize the stress and allow his concentration to improve. Last but not least, we have an example of an electrician with severe depression who needed to attend periodic licensure trainings. This person struggled with effectively taking notes and paying attention, and as a result, the employer accommodated the individual with notes from Remote Communication Access Real-Time Translation Service, or CART. So here's an example of an employer utilizing an outside resource to help accommodate an employee who's struggling with an underlying disability. For more information on mental health disabilities, there's a variety of links that we have here for you to access that provide some greater information. I would encourage you also to explore the Job Accommodation Network website. That's on there as askjan.org, and there's some valuable resources out there to help think through the ADA and an employer's responsibilities to engage in the interactive process, but in the context of mental health disabilities.
Time for some questions?
We're going to stay on. I believe we have some questions that we'll do our best to answer, but if I see our time is up as well, so if certain people need to leave, that, feel free to do that, but we will go ahead and address these questions. So
the first question we have is, if an employee is being treated for menopause symptoms, which are causing significant mood swings, trouble focusing, and symptoms of that sort. Is this protected, and what are reasonable accommodations? The ADA and courts have actually already spoken to this, and they've said that no, generally menopause in and of itself is not a disability, but rather a natural progression over time, and it's an inevitable part of the human condition. So menopause is not normally a disability. However, if menopause comes on suddenly, say from chemotherapy, or if someone suddenly needs their reproductive organs to be removed, sudden menopause like that can be considered a disability, but generally it is not. However, even though it's not considered a disability under the ADA, that does not mean that the employer cannot accommodate. So you still have the option to modify dress code, allow flexible scheduling, the ability to work from home, things of that nature.
So we also received a great question on marriage counseling, and if an employee would be able to take off work for counseling sessions, and would it be considered sick time? So that's a question that I would certainly advise to look at your policy on what constitutes sick time and eligibility to take off work for access to your sick leave policy, and I would follow your policy. There's a separate question embedded here, which is whether an employee who is going through difficulties in their marriage has an underlying disability under the ADA. So in order to trigger an employer's obligation to engage in an interactive process and provide a reasonable accommodation, the employee has to have a disability. So the question for me under this scenario is, does the employee have an underlying disability that's impacting their ability to perform essential job functions? Then the question would be, is allowing the employee time off work to seek marriage counseling a reasonable accommodation that would still allow the employee to perform essential job functions? So that's how I would walk through that scenario. Another great question, is the employer required to accept documentation from a doctor if the employee was seen by an individual using a holistic approach? So that falls under the category of, do you really as an employer have sufficient information from your employee to be able to evaluate their request for an accommodation? An employer can challenge the medical health professional's qualifications. You might not have enough information to be able to evaluate whether the individual has a disability. In those circumstances, and again, I'd want more information, but that's a situation where I think you might have grounds to ask the employee to see the employer's medical health professional to be evaluated, to have a better understanding of their alleged disability and whether their request for accommodation is reasonable. Another great question of, can an employee request to switch to a shift with Saturdays, Sundays off due to need for family time based on a counselor's suggestion? So without knowing the full context, if the individual is seeing a counselor because they have a disability, and seeing the counselor are the only opportunity for them I should say, if the counselor's recommendation for treatment of the disability is to spend more time with family, then you might be looking at a request for reasonable accommodation. Again, as with the question addressing marriage counseling, the first step is, does the individual have a disability? The second step is, what are the essential job functions? Let's engage in an interactive process and see if we can accommodate this employee. Another question, if you are allowing an accommodation of time off, how does that work with required hours to keep benefits? That's a question that I would really want more information, but generally speaking, you don't have to modify existing policies that would advantage that employee above others. always important to keep in mind when you're making these decisions that you're looking at how you have treated similarly situated employees. So if you have had other employees where their hours have been reduced, how have their benefits been treated? And that is where I would direct employers to first look at those inquiries and gather more information. So sort of a factually intensive question there, but those are some general thoughts.
Our last question was, can you ask at the end of an interview, are you able to do the required functions of a job without a reasonable accommodation? Do you have to wait until you offer the job to ask the question in this way?
So I think that the question you would want to ask is whether the applicant is capable of performing the essential functions of the job. I would stop there because of the dangers, and that should elicit the information that you're wanting to seek from the employee without drawing a challenge that you've asked a disability-related question, which is prohibited prior to a conditional job offer. So the last question that we got is addiction to illegal substances or illegal use of prescription medicine protected by the ADA? No. So under the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's specifically precluded that use of illegal drugs is not a protected activity. Now, I will say that in the area of medicinal marijuana, there are state laws now that have legalized the use of medicinal marijuana, and there was a recent Supreme Court decision out of a state on the East Coast that I can't recall off the top of my head, but that Supreme Court decision said that the state's Anti-Discrimination Act was violated when an employer terminated an employee who tested positive for medicinal marijuana because the use of medicinal marijuana had been legalized under state law. Even though the ADA still says use of illegal drugs does not constitute a disability, be cautious in the area of medicinal marijuana if you have employees that are in a state where medicinal marijuana has been legalized. It won't implicate the ADA at this point, but it might implicate state anti-discrimination laws. Well, we so appreciate all of your questions and your time and attention today, and encourage you to reach out to Melissa if you have an interest in our live seminars, which will be on October 3rd and October 5th, and look forward to you joining us for additional webinars in the future, which you'll be included in the invites for now that you've participated today. And our contact information is on this slide, and feel free to reach out to either Lauren or I with any questions you might have on mental health impairment or general employment law questions. And this is your code for anyone who is seeking credits, SHRM credits. All right, well, thank you for joining us.